Boris Johnson warned Russia that Donald Trump's willingness to bomb Syria is a game-changer today as he backed sanctions against Kremlin generals. The foreign secretary urged Vladimir Putin to recognize the strength of international condemnation as he met counterparts from the powerful G7 nations in Italy. After holding an hour of private talks with U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson this afternoon, Mr. Johnson said they were in total agreement that Bashar Assad must go in the wake of the chemical atrocity in Idlib last week. He said the G7 was considering escalating sanctions against Russian and Syrian generals involved in the military campaign. The choice is to stick like glue to the Assad regime or to work with the rest of the world, Mr. Johnson told reporters at the summit in Lucca. Mr. Johnson said Russia's reputation was being toxified by its connection with Assad. We will be discussing the possibility of further sanctions, certainly on some of the Syrian military figures and indeed on some of the Russian military figures who have been involved in coordinating the Syrian military efforts and are thereby contaminated by the appalling behavior of the Assad regime, he added. Earlier, Mr. Tillerson teed up the two-day summit by saying the U.S. was rededicating itself to hold to account any and all who commit crimes against innocent people. But Russia is attempting to defuse the issue by proposing an independent and impartial investigation of the attack in Idlib province last week. The Kremlin has claimed Assad's jets blew up a rebel stash of chemical weapons. Alongside sanctions, re-entry to the elite club of power nations is thought to be too on the table as an incentive for cooperating. Russia was kicked out of what was the G8 in 2014 as punishment for the annexation of Crimea. Moscow's foreign ministry has taunted Mr. Johnson for being in the shadow of the U.S. In a statement, it said the cancellation once again confirms doubts about the added value of dialogue with the British, who don't have their own position on the majority of current issues. The UK has no real influence on the course of international affairs, the ministry added. Mr. Johnson faced claims he was Washington's poodle over the weekend after he agreed to pull out of a planned visit to Moscow following discussions with the U.S. The trip was cancelled, so the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and America can agree a joint plan, which will then be delivered by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Instead, yesterday Mr. Johnson's aides claimed he himself had taken the decision to abandon the meeting so they could deliver a clear and coordinated message to Moscow. Whitehall sources last night said Mr. Johnson was pushing for the group to agree sanctions against Russia if they continue to support a regime that gasses its own people. One source familiar with the discussions said, "Very punitive sanctions on Russia for Syria is one option being considered. Punishments being discussed include economic sanctions and further isolation from the international community, including the threat that it will not be allowed to rejoin G8 group of nations." In 2014, Russia was suspended from the group of leading economies to which it was admitted in 1998 over the annexation of Crimea. Mr. Johnson wants to see a plan under which Putin agrees that Assad needs to go, removes Russian troops from Syria, and helps to rebuild the troubled state. A government source denied claims Mr. Johnson had been pushed into canceling his trip to Moscow because he was not trusted by America. He said, "The important thing is that this is Britain helping to influence U.S. policy, far from being a poodle. 3 months ago Syria wasn't really an issue for them, but our push and recent events have made a difference." Defense Secretary Michael Fallon said Russia was to blame by proxy for Assad's chemical weapons attack because it was the Syria's principal backer. Writing in the Sunday Times, Sir Michael said, however, Russia must be part of the solution. He also reiterated his support of Mr. Trump's cruise missile strike in the early hours of Friday, saying it has sent a strong signal to the Syrian regime to think twice before using gas in the future. Mr. Tillerson echoed the comments, telling CBS TV that the Russians have played now for some time the role of providing cover for Assad's behavior. But asked about the possibility of further intervention, he said Washington's first priority in Syria is to defeat Islamic State